All right, so if we're thinking about contemporary moral issues, we have to think about oppression, right? Oppression is a huge contemporary moral issue, but it's kind of different from the other contemporary moral issues we've been focusing on with respect to euthanasia and drug use and pornography and terrorism, because it's going off of contemporary theories of oppression, and there really isn't kind of like a pro con to it. It's discussing what oppression is and how it's experienced by people. So if we're thinking about oppression, we have to kind of consistently connect it to how it is unethical, right? How is it violating autonomy? How is it violating our human dignity? How is it violating our happiness? How is it violating eudaimonia and Aristotle's idea of flourishing? So Iris Marion Young in The Five Faces of Oppression conveys what oppression is and discusses how it can be experienced differently by different people based off of their social membership, their social group membership. So the purpose of Iris Marion Young's essay, The Five Faces of Oppression, is to expand the understanding of oppression to institutional injustices. Oppression, prior to when this article was written, it was only kind of thought of as something that governments can do to its citizens or the civilians. It was only thought of as kind of a very narrow idea of injustice. And Iris Marion Young wants to kind of expand the idea of oppression so we can think about institutional injustices, institutional forms of inequality, institutional prejudice. What is institutional? Institutional is beyond us, right? It's beyond our interpersonal interactions. It's beyond our interpersonal behaviors. It's beyond the individual. It's something that is perpetuated and manifested by the structures we have in our society. So oppression can be manifested and perpetuated by the education system. The education system is an institution of society. The housing system, the bank system, the government, the legal system, right? All of these are institutions in society that are structural, that are much larger than us as individuals, that can perpetuate oppression. So what is oppression? Her definition of oppression is basically that all oppressed people face an inhibition of one's ability to develop and exercise their full capacities and abilities and needs and thoughts and feelings, right? So there's this inhibition, you're being pressed, right? So not all oppressed people, though, experience oppression in the same way. They all experience, though, this inhibition, capacities, and feelings, but they don't experience this inhibition in the same way. So we'll talk then about what these five faces of oppression are in the next video, but I want to discuss this definition of oppression because it's based off of membership in a social group or membership in a social category and how oppression is structural, right? So if something is structural, right, it's institutional, it's much larger than us. It also has to do with unquestioned norms and habits and biases and symbols in our society. So they're manifested through conscious and unconscious assumptions that well-meaning people embody in everyday interactions with people. So think about how the media portrays specific groups of people. Think about cultural stereotypes. Think about institutional inequalities in pay and salary when it comes to various races or when it comes to LGBTQ plus individuals versus heterosexual individuals. Think about the pay gap between men and women, where white women make 70 cents for every dollar white men make. This number goes down to 65 cents for African American and Latinx women. So these are examples of institutional and structural forms of oppression. And these aspects of structural oppression are based off of one's arbitrary membership in a social group. So oppression is structural and it immobilizes and diminishes a group. So you're not viewed as you're viewed as you're not viewed as a dynamic, autonomous individual that you're just representing yourself. No. If you are oppressed, you're viewed as being a part of that social group that you are thought to belong to, right? You are viewed as a representative for that group. What is a social group? If oppression is based off of your membership in a social group, well, what is a social group? A social group is a collective of individuals that are differentiated from other groups in at least one or more ways. So it can be cultural practices, ways of life, traditions, languages, etc. It's an expression of social relations and labor relations. It gives people a sense of identity, right? Social groups in themselves are not bad, right? Having differences is not bad. It's how these differences in these groups are interpreted that leads to all of these problems of oppression in our society. So in order to understand how oppression works, we must go beyond this individualistic idea of the self, that we're not just autonomous, right? We do have an individual idea of identity, but it's really hard to know where that idea of identity is coming from because we are immersed in a society with all of these social relationships. And so the self, then, how I understand myself, how you understand yourself, is a product of these social processes, right? So therefore, if we have to, in order to understand ourselves, in order to understand other people, we have to understand these social processes, which are mired in group categorization. So for example, gender is a social construction, or race is a social construction, yet these are real lived experiences for people, right? Since we are all gendered and raced in our society. So identities then are defined in relation to one another. They're not just defined in isolation, they're defined in relation to these identities and to how we interact with one another with respect to stereotypes and norms and attributes, representations in society. So we'll talk more about what these stereotypes, some examples of these stereotypes and norms and attributes when we talk about the 5 phases of oppression. But I wanted to discuss the overall definition of oppression and then how it relates to this idea of social groups, how oppression is based off of viewing someone as being a representative of that social group, and it's based off of inhibiting people who identify in that social group from fully exercising their capacities and abilities. So in the next video then, we will talk about what these 5 phases of oppression actually are.